I'm not really sure if this product should exist. It's called the Nothing Phone 3A Lite, and it's touted by the manufacturer as being their most affordable to date, which they're not technically wrong about. However, if you do look at its sub-brand, CMF, there's the Phone 2 Pro, which comes in at the same sort of price point, and other than having near identical specifications, actually offers a telephoto lens which is omitted altogether in the Nothing Phone. Now, the Phone 3A Lite can be found for £249 in the UK or €249 across Europe, and this will give you 8GB of RAM and 128GB of internal storage. If you want 256GB of internal storage, you'll have to add an additional £30 or €30 on top. Now, in this review, you're going to see if it's actually worth its price tag, how it compares to its sibling, and of course, its rivals. So let us kick off and talk about its design, and here it's available in a black and white finish, of course the former being pictured. It weighs in at just 199 grams and is 8.3mm thick, therefore making it very easy to hold in a hand. In the box you'll also find a protective see-through case, which is a nice addition in terms of giving you some extra protection for drops. This is because the phone at the front and back has got Panda glass, and it's also got a plastic frame. The phone itself is rated with IP54, therefore giving you some extra peace of mind. Now, in terms of interacting with the smartphone, you have got a power button on the right hand side. However, inconveniently, just below it, you've got the essential space button, which is effectively for you to save certain notes or indeed use AI to increase your workflow. I just feel that certain individuals might not actually want to use it, and given that you can't currently reprogram it, it does mean that that button can be unnecessarily used and also potentially redundant. Now, on the opposite edge, you have got the volume rocker, while towards the bottom edge, you've got a USB Type-C port. Then on one side, you have got the dual nano SIM tray, and here you'll also find a micro SD card expansion slot. And it's worth noting that this phone does not support eSIM capabilities, while on the other side of the edge, you've got a downward firing speaker, which isn't exactly the best in the world in terms of the overall sound quality that it reproduces, but it does get to a decent volume. Now, towards the bottom edge and underneath the display, you'll also find an optical fingerprint sensor, which is actually really snappy, although I just wish that its placement was a little further up, as it would have been quite useful for one-handed operation. Now, you can also pair this up with Face Unlock, although just bear in mind over here it's not using 3D biometric data for your face and therefore isn't as secure as using a regular PIN or password or of course your fingerprints. Now, this does bring me onto the slab of glass that's found at the front of the phone. And here you've got a 6.77-inch 120Hz AMOLED display with support for HDR. It also has a resolution of 1080 by 2392, so therefore everything looks actually pretty sharp. In terms of the peak brightness, I recorded 730 nits using my calibrators, be it in terms of the auto or the maximum modes, therefore making it pretty bright in sunlit conditions. I used it at roughly 80% brightness underneath the sun. In terms of its minimum brightness, it gets all the way down to 2.2 nits, showing good amount of range, although it isn't as dim as some alternatives out there that will get down to 1 to under 2 nits. Still, it's good to see that you have got 2160Hz PWM dimming, and therefore takes away some of the eye strain, namely if you're using it in low light conditions. Now, flipping over the phone, we get onto the contentious topic of talking about its camera system, because in comparison to the CMF Phone 2 Pro, a lot of people, including myself, see it as a downgrade. And this is because the telephoto lens has been replaced with a 2MP f2.4 macro lens, which I suspect most people are never going to utilize, namely because of the lower megapixel count. Nonetheless, in terms of the main lens, you've got a 50MP with f1.88 and EIS, not to be confused with OIS, which has been touted to be included online, but that is actually false information. In terms of the ultra-wide lens, you've got an 8MP with f2.2. Now, yes indeed, unlike the CMF Phone 2 Pro, it doesn't offer as much zoom, where it's capped in at 10 times, and of course that is digital as well. Here, when it comes to just zooming in, be it in normal or low light conditions, the Phone 3A Lite does indeed suffer. But still, if you're not going to be zooming in all the way, you'll actually find that the main camera lens, very much like its sibling, actually does excel. At this sort of price point, I can't think of many other smartphones that will give you such good shots, be it in terms of the overall tonality and also in terms of how the image is actually being reproduced, and also in terms of the amount of detail that you're capturing. Frankly, I think a lot of people will be left impressed by what Nothing have been able to achieve. Yes, indeed, the same sort of performance could be said about the CMF phone, but it's still worth considering over here that this phone is not indeed compromised. Now, if you're going to be utilizing the ultra-wide lens, just bear in mind that you're getting that lower megapixel count, and as a result, the shots will look a little bit more blurry. But if you're taking it in normal or low light conditions, where the latter is more severely affected because it's a lot harder to draw in some light, all while providing you a good clear image. So flipping over the phone yet again, you'll find the 16 megapixel f2.45 selfie camera, which actually does pretty well across the board. The same could be said about its sibling, the CMF. It provides a good amount of light and also gives good sorts of tones on your skin. I had no issues whatsoever, and it's also good to see that the portrait mode does work a treat, in that it doesn't feel too artificially processed and does cut me out pretty well. Indeed, over here when it comes to taking selfies, I've got no complaints whatsoever. So what about when it comes to its recording capabilities? Well, here, very much like the CMF Phone 2 Pro, it can shoot 4K 30fps or 1080p at 30, 60 or 120 fps, with the latter only being available with the slow-mo mode. This is with the rear camera lenses. You'll also get up to 6 times digital zoom. While at the front, you have got 1080p recordings at 30 and 60 fps. Now, while its capabilities are decent and it's nice to see a 4K option, it does indeed struggle in terms of the overall stabilization. And that's purely because it's relying solely on AI and also EIS, which stands for Electronic Image Stabilization. As I did mention before, there's some misinformation that you can find online with OIS being utilized, but that's not actually the case. Indeed, over here, you'll have some camera shake, at least if you're going to be moving around. But I suspect a lot of people won't be doing it in such a way and instead be actually at a stationary point and then panning around. And in this instance, the camera does provide a good sort of performance, even if you're quite far away from your subject. This also includes in normal and low light conditions, where it's actually pretty impressive in what it was able to achieve in the latter, but of course do set your expectations in check in that it's not going to compete with far more expensive phones which have got bigger sensors and more capable lenses. So next up we get onto battery life, and here you've got a 5000 mAh capacity, the same that you'd find on the CMF Phone 2 Pro. However, in terms of my controlled benchmarks, there were some differences, in that the Phone 3a Lite netted 24 hours and 3 minutes, while the CMF clocked in at 27 hours. Nonetheless, the Phone 3a Lite should last you roughly 1.5 to 2 days of usage, at least for light to medium use, and if you're a heavy user, then expect sub 1 day. Now, in terms of replenishing its battery pack, it's got 33 watts of wired charging capabilities, allowing you to go from 0 to 50% in 20 minutes or up to 100% in under an hour. There's also 5 watts of wired reverse charging capabilities. However, it is worth pointing out that there is no wireless charging capabilities. No surprise, given there are a lot of other phones at this sort of price point that don't offer said feature. Moving swiftly on, we get onto performance. And here you've got the MediaTek Dimensity 7300 Pro 5G chipset, which operates on a 4nm structure. Here you've also got 8GB of RAM, and there's also an additional 8GB that can be added via a virtual RAM booster, which effectively uses your storage. Now, using Geekbench 6, I noted a single core score of 1012 and a multi-core score of 2886. And indeed, this is very much near identical to its sibling, the CMF Phone 2 Pro. In terms of GFX bench, it goes from 6.2 to 81 FPS. In other words, this can be utilized for light gaming usage, or of course, if you're just going to be browsing the web, but if you do expect it to perform far better, then you might want to look at some alternatives, be it in terms of hardcore gaming, or indeed if you've got a lot of apps open and a lot of tabs. This actually perfectly brings me onto software. And yes, indeed, in terms of the overall chipset performance, it's not going to set your world alight. But thankfully, you have got Nothing OS 3.5, which is built upon Android 15. And here you're promised up to 3 years of updates with 6 years of security patches as well. Not exactly groundbreaking and a little bit mediocre in comparison to the alternatives out there. Nonetheless, the overall software experience is very fluid, and therefore means that you almost forget about the chipset that's being utilized. Of course, if you're going to be comparing it to much more expensive smartphones, it will feel a bit laggy and will just lack the sort of snappiness that you might expect. Still, I just like the almost near stock Android experience, although it's worth noting over here that nothing have also pre-installed 3 social media apps, such as the likes of Instagram and Facebook, and this is just in order for the manufacturer to help it bring down its cost. Something that might be a little bit contentious within the community, but I don't have many issues with it because you can simply uninstall the apps within a single touch. Now, in terms of what else you've got Wi-Fi AX dual band support, Bluetooth 5.4, you've got NFC, which is useful for contactless payments, and you've also got between 128 and 256 gigabytes of internal storage, which is, by the way, expandable by up to 2 terabytes thanks to the use of a micro SD card, which can be utilized instead of one of your SIM slots. Then you have also got USB 2.0, which might be a little bit disheartening for certain individuals because it means you get slower transfer speeds. But still, given its overall price point, I can't complain all that much. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of the Nothing Phone 3A Lite. And as I did mention at the beginning of this video, I'm not really sure why it exists. And that's purely because its sub-brand CMF offer the Phone 2 Pro. There's certain rumors suggesting that CMF will branch out to another company, and that's why nothing has brought out the 3A Lite. Regardless of what you think, the CMF phone just makes a lot more sense because it's got that telephoto lens, near identical specifications, other than missing a glyph light. And therefore coming at the same sort of price point, that is what I would actively recommend, namely if you're on a budget. But make no mistake, the Phone 3A Lite is still a good all-rounder. You've got a fantastic software, a nice screen, good camera performance, even in low light conditions, and also a decent battery life. Given all of this, I can still see myself recommending it as an alternative to what else you can find out there on the market, and as such, it gets my value award. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below, and of course, if you agree or disagree with my verdict. If you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing, and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.